Thank you, everybody, for attending our third Applied U webinar sponsored by Bentley University and the Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology. My name is Gary David, and I am the past president of the AACS. Our main reason for these webinars is to provide professional development and educational opportunities to both our members and other interested parties alike. We are fortunate today to have Dr. Karen Albright from the University of Denver and her consulting company, Lacuna Analytics, to discuss qualitative methods and mixed methods in grants writing. This webinar is based off of her professional development workshop, which she held at the 2018 AACS annual meeting in Norfolk. A few housekeeping items before we begin. If you have any questions, please provide them in the chat box located in the Zoom screen, and you can provide those questions anytime during the webinar. But Dr. Albright has requested that we only cover the questions at the end of the webinar. And any questions that she can't get to in the time allotted, you can feel free to contact her after the webinar is over and pose your question to her directly. We are recording the webinar, and a copy of it will be uploaded to the AACS Applied U YouTube site. I will send out an announcement and a link once it is up. You can also find past webinars there as well, which include our Crafting Your Sociological Brand webinar and Sociology for Experience Design. I would also like to announce that our next webinar will be on February 25th at 12 Eastern Standard Time with Dr. Jonathan White of Bentley University, when he will be talking about social entrepreneurship, another professional development workshop he gave at the 2018 AACS conference. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Albright to talk about grantsmanship for qualitative and mixed methods proposals.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being in attendance today. And I'm very excited to join you and share a little bit of my tips and advice for how to successfully apply for grants or external funding using qualitative and mixed methods approaches, which have not historically been treated as or reviewed as thoroughly and have as in-depth comprehensive understanding by reviewers. But that's changing, and I'm excited to share with you information about how that happens. But first, a little bit about me. I am a sociologist and a health services researcher. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Denver, and affiliated faculty in the Department of Community and Behavioral Health in the Colorado School of Public Health. I'm also an affiliated investigator in the Adult and Child Consortium for Health Outcomes Research and Delivery Science at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, where prior to coming to DU, for years I directed the Qualitative Research Methods Core. At which place I certainly honed a lot of the tips I'm going to be sharing with you today. I am also the co-director and founder of Lacuna Analytics, which is a company that's focused on data translation and implementation. Happy to talk about any of those things in the Q&A or after the webinar if you are interested. My areas of expertise in terms of my substantive areas are typically the social determinants of mental and physical health, health behaviors among socioeconomically disadvantaged populations, and healthcare workplace culture and systems dynamics. I typically approach those things through qualitative and mixed methodologies and am, in fact, a qualitative methodologist and expert. And in recent years, I've become particularly focused on translation and integration of health and behavioral and social sciences, as well as dissemination and implementation science. I feel that this time is an incredible opportunity for social scientists in particular to share their expertise in systems dynamics and in process, as well as other more specific substantive focus into the clinical world because they certainly need our expertise. Again, I'm happy to talk more about that over the course of the hour and in the Q&A. I have extensive grantsmanship experience. Since 2010, I have been the principal investigator, the co-principal investigator, or a co-investigator on 26 research grants that together have secured over $21 million in funding. And most of these projects are focused on enhancing the functionality of the healthcare system, driving health equity across populations, and improving health outcomes. The goal for most of this work is to attain positive change for vulnerable populations, as well as for care providers who work within this system and a variety of other system stakeholders. What I'm going to be focused on today is essentially I've divided up into three separate parts that hopefully will be complementary to each other. The first one is we're going to talk about some basic grantsmanship considerations, particularly around fit and design. I'll give you an overview of the major funding agencies and mechanisms, and we'll talk a little bit about basic elements of research design and methods that you might want to include in your proposal. Then we'll move specifically to a qualitative focus. And I'm going to structure that conversation around the key elements that reviewers of grant applications are asked to address and understand and rate. And we'll talk about how those can be managed and navigated successfully with qualitative data specifically, which again doesn't always lend itself to the conventions that some reviewers are used to. We'll also talk a little bit about qualitative budget considerations because that is, while not a formal review criterion, it is something very important to think about as you put together your proposal. And finally, we will turn to a discussion about mixed methods. Mixed methodological research, meaning a combination of qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis techniques is increasingly expected in this day and age because they provide together both breadth and depth. So we'll talk a little bit about how to manage that as you think about putting together a study and a proposal, particularly around dimensions of methodological combination, and I'll give you some mixed method design typologies that may be useful as you are putting together your language for the grant. So let's start with the first section here, basic grantsmanship considerations. Now, I probably don't have to tell you that it is critical to understand the variety of different agencies and mechanisms that are out there so that you can ascertain fit with your project. It's in some ways hard to categorize all of the different opportunities out there, but I've arranged them for today's talk in three main buckets. There are governmental agencies, both federal and state, although I will focus primarily on federal agencies today, private foundations, and then there are internal institutional funding opportunities that may be available to you at your institution, whether it's academic or non-academic. It's very important, of course, to think through all the available resources to you and to utilize them in order to ensure that you understand the focus of the agency and the mechanism that you're interested in and its fit with your work. So in other words, you don't have to do this alone. There are typically, especially if you work in an academic environment, there are typically some arrangement, maybe perhaps an office or other kinds of institutional resources and personnel who've been trained to do this. I think sometimes people are a little bit shy about approaching these people, but I urge you not to be. Although admittedly, depending on where you are and who you're speaking with, these folks have varying degrees of savvy about the grant world. Nonetheless, they're useful to talk with, not only to get tips, but also to have them be looking on your behalf for opportunities that might be a fit for your work. Another really important resource that you should take advantage of are the project officers at each agency that you may consider applying to. Again, there are, these people have varying degrees of interest in talking with you in detail, but for the most part, it's their job to talk with you, cultivate a relationship, and then if it feels like a good fit, to bring your project to fruition. So be sure that you reach out. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. Be sure that you try to reach out to those folks and strike up a relationship. Now, often people ask me about what federal agencies award grants. And the truth is that almost all of them do. Some are more publicized than others, but virtually all federal agencies out there offer at least one and typically many different grant mechanisms. On this slide here, there are just, as you can see, just a smattering to show you the wide variety. And if you want to get a comprehensive listing, I urge you to go to grants.gov, which is a great resource. You'll see that one of these federal agencies here is bolded, and that's the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This, like all of these agencies, encompasses a number of different institutes and centers, including the National Institutes of Health, the AHRQ, which is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and so on. And that is the agency that, for purposes of walking us through this today, that I'm going to focus on in particular. And within that, we're going to focus on the National Institutes of Health. The reason, partly for this, is the agency that I know the best because my work is in health and health services. But it's also a great exemplar of the wide range of grant opportunities that might be found within these federal agencies. So let's just walk through the NIH structure. And again, hopefully this will be specifically helpful for those of you who do work in the health field. But even if you don't do work in the health field, I want you to view this as an example of the types of structures that these other grants have, these other mechanisms and agencies have. So the NIH is the primary agency of the US government that's responsible for biomedical and public health research. The way it is set up is that it's made up of 27 institutes and centers, and each of these have a specific research agenda. These might include the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, National Institute of Mental Health. The list goes on, and you can see a full listing at the link that I've provided on this slide. But I also want to mention here, because it may be of interest to social scientists, that NIH also includes the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research. Now, the OBSSR doesn't award grants, but it does provide funding support to a variety of NIH centers and institutes through its co-funding program. In addition, it supports a variety of innovative training opportunities, specifically for social scientists who are working in health. For example, I participated a few years ago in the Social Network Analysis program through their larger Systems Science and Health program, and I would highly recommend that. OBSSR's mission is to enhance the impact of health-related behavioral and social sciences research, and to communicate health-related behavioral and social sciences research findings to various stakeholders within and outside the federal government. If you're interested in this kind of work, I would encourage you to visit their website. Now, NIH has a number of different funding opportunities within it. Again, I want you to take this as an example of how these federal agencies are often structured. You can see here there are the R series, the K series, TNF series, P series, and a variety of other programs that are trans-institutional. If you're a young investigator listening to this, I would encourage you in particular to look at the Career Development Grants, or their K series, which are incredible resources and can really set you up very nicely for a long career that's well supported. But today, again, you can see the full list and descriptions at that link. Today, again, just for the purposes of example, just want to highlight a few of NIH's R series, just again to give you a sense of how these things vary and the wide range of different opportunities that might be available to you. You can see that the R01, the R03, the R13, R15, and R21 all have different limits in terms of funding and time constraints, and different focuses that may be helpful to you depending on what you want to do. For instance, let's say you're just getting started on putting things together and you want to really gather in order to understand a topic very fully, you want to bring together a number of experts in a field and have a conference or a scientific meeting so that everybody can brainstorm together and move the field forward in a collective and collaborative way. You might be interested then in applying for the R13. You can get support for up to 5 years, although the award amounts will vary by the institute or center that you specifically put your application through to. And this website right here, the screenshot, is a great way to get started in terms of becoming familiar with the specific funding opportunities and notices that may be available through each institute or center at NIH. Again, this is very typical of other federal agencies as well. So, you know, you can Google the Office of Extramural Research within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and find a variety of different requests for applications and program announcements that may be interesting and helpful to you for your work. Now I want to move to a brief discussion about private foundations. Remember, this is the second of the three buckets that I wanted to highlight in terms of exposing you to different opportunities for funding your research. Now, the bulk of research dollars, certainly even today, still comes from the government. In 2016, private sources gave about $2.3 billion to scientific research, compared to federal agencies which contributed approximately $40 billion. So clearly there's a big difference between $40 billion and $2 billion. But as we're all probably aware, $2 billion is not chump change either. And so these are the resources devoted to research and scientific endeavors through private foundations is only increasing every year. And so it may be a good opportunity for you to consider, especially given that NIH, as well as pretty much all the other government agencies, have historically demonstrated an almost innate wariness of uncertain outcomes. In other words, the science that they typically support tends to be quite narrow, highly specified, and sometimes limiting in terms of the potential novelness or innovation of what you may want to do. Now, in contrast to that, private funders, private foundations have a different set of interests, and they have a freedom to build longer timelines into the projects that they fund. And that means that returns on their investment need not be immediate. In other words, it might not have to be within the 2 years or the 5 years that the federal agencies typically require. And this freedom, this wiggle room, if you will, is really changing the research funding game. And I want you to think about how that might be useful to your own work. You can see here just a smattering of private foundations that have contributed significant amounts. This is again in calendar year 2016. And these are foundations that have supported a variety of scientific efforts, including social scientific efforts. So you can get a sense that this is a significant amount of money, particularly within 1 year. And for the most part, this is out there for the taking because people aren't quite as aware of this as an opportunity. There are also a number of smaller organizations or agencies that specifically fund social scientific research that you should be aware of. These include, for the sociologists on this webinar, the American Sociological Association, particularly their Fund for the Advancement of the Discipline Program, as well as another, if you're interested in health, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is a fantastic organization. If you have an anthropological focus, the Werner Gren Foundation is a great resource. And you can go through and look at these different organizations in terms of the applicability of their work. But they're out there is the point. And for the most part, these are excellent opportunities for you to move your own research forward. Now, the third and final bucket that I want to mention briefly in terms of exposing you to different opportunities to fund your work are these internal institutional funding opportunities. So if you work within an academic institution, or even if you don't, the chances are very good that your institution will have a number of these funding opportunities that you should utilize. These often go untapped. Now, these funding awards are typically smaller and or more constrained than those from government agencies or private foundations, and they tend to expect more specific deliverables, but they can be so useful in getting your research off the ground. And they can be used as seed money, you know, particularly to, if you can frame it as you're collecting preliminary data for a larger project, and then that can lead to different opportunities down the road. At my institution at the University of Denver, we have something called the Prof Grant, which provides $20,000 for a solo project or $30,000 for collaborative projects. Similarly, at the University of Colorado Medical Campus, the CCTSI, the Colorado Clinical and Translational Science Institute, has a number of community engagement awards that award about $15,000 for partnership development and $30,000 for pilot research projects. And another organization with whom I've done a lot of work, the VA, the Department of Veteran Affairs, has something similar for a smaller, for a rather larger bunch of change, the Quality Enhancement Research Initiatives, which are limited typically to about $100,000. So you can get a lot of work done between $20,000 and $100,000. And again, this can be used for some seed money to situate you well down the road. Now, before we move into the specifics about how to manage this with a qualitative lens, I want to give you some, basic, general, important advice. Certainly, it's critical from a grantsmanship point of view to understand the funding mechanisms. Each funding mechanism that is offered by an agency will have specificities that are critical, and that if you don't understand them and you don't know how to navigate them successfully, then you will not probably get reviewed, and certainly you probably will not get awarded. So read that funding opportunity announcement carefully, and as I mentioned before, call the project officer, reach out to him or her, and try to develop a relationship. It could not be more important. You also, of course, want to follow the format directions. Most of these applications require very specific adherence to a particular kind of format. So don't skimp on that. That's certainly important. And you want to be strategic. You want to incorporate the review criteria that it will be available to you, particularly from federal agencies, and you want to be able to make sure that you check all those boxes. And for many of these agencies, the federal agencies in particular, you'll be able to see who is in the study section, which is a group of people who are your reviewers and who will be literally reviewing your grant and giving it a score that will allow you to be funded or not. So you can look to see the composition of that study section, who those people are, and then you can Google them or look them up otherwise and find out what kind of work that they do and what methodological orientations or theoretical orientations they will likely be most amenable to. And it's critical, of course, if you're planning to conduct qualitative research, you want to be sure that the agency and the mechanism and the announcement that you're thinking about applying to, that those are friendly to qualitative data. You want them to be receptive. There are some that have next to no familiarity with qualitative methods and have not funded qualitative methods in the past, and you want to think carefully if you're going to apply to those, because I think your likelihood will be considerably lower. And of course, you also, we'll deal with this a little bit more in a few minutes, but you also want to be really certain that qualitative data are appropriate for your research question. That sounds somewhat basic, but I can't tell you how many people sometimes overlook this, but it's critical that your research question be answerable by the method that you've chosen. And if you're proposing a qualitative method, there's certainly no difference there. Now, the generic elements of a research design are as follows, right? You want to, of course, include an overview of the study purpose and design. You want to be clear about your population selection, and that might include things like your sampling frame, your inclusion and exclusion criteria of the population. Of course, you want to be specific and clear about your data collection and analysis, both your methods and your rationale, but also your outcomes and any other kind of key covariates that are going to be playing a role in your work. You also want to specify your data management plan, both in terms of data management software, your plan for documentation, your plan for archiving if relevant. You want to also spell out your quality assurance and or quality control mechanisms. This might include things like training and the training and expertise of team members, how things like supervising is going to take place, PI checks, reviews and audits, what process you're going to have in place if you have multiple coders on a project, and certainly the establishment of intercoder reliability. You also want to be clear about your project administration and management, and that would mean things like management structure, in terms of the organizational structure of your team, the roles everyone will have, your project tracking, including reporting and any kind of anticipated milestones, and how project communications are going to go. Are you going to have staff meetings? Will you have meetings with external collaborators? How will conflict be managed, particularly if there are multiple PIs, as there often are for large projects? And then, of course, you want to cover your limitations. And this is an important consideration. Many junior investigators or people new to this project have a tendency to want to gloss over or omit any limitations on their work, but that is ill-advised. Reviewers worth their salt are going to be aware of any limitations, or at least some limitations, because every project has them. Every project, no matter what method or approach. So you would be well advised to address these openly and honestly, and then to include a plan for how you're going to minimize any kind of negative effect of the limitations. So here you'd want to talk about the potential for selection bias, meaning potential sources and consequences or strategies to prevent or minimize that bias. You also might want to think about information bias. Again, strategies to prevent or minimize that, how you might conduct validation studies to make sure that, or to limit that bias, and any kind of adjustment methods that you might want to include. You also want to mention here any kind of external validity issues or barriers to generalizability, which is not going to be uncommon in qualitative work. And to talk a little bit about the feasibility of what you've proposed in terms of your population identification, your data collection, and the costs of all this. But ultimately, the aspect, the most critical elements here for clarity come down to what's on this slide here. You need to be crystal clear about what the problem is at hand, of course, what your design is and the rationale for that design, what your population is, the rationale for that population, what will be done, how it will be done, where it will be done, and what your schedule for doing so is. That sounds a little basic, but again, you would be surprised how many people gloss over that or make that unclear. And I have reviewed a number of grants myself, and I can tell you as a reviewer that is quite frustrating. Okay, so let's now move into the specifics about working with a grant proposal when you are using qualitative data. This does not have to be solely qualitative, but any kind of grant proposal that you're putting together that incorporates qualitative data, you'd be well advised to think through some tips here that I'm going to include, that I'm going to talk about in terms of putting your best foot forward working with qualitative data. So again, we're going to kind of walk through the review criteria based on the NIH, partly because, again, this is the health domain is one that I know well, but also because these reviewer criteria are ones that in one way or another, all applications are going to ask you to comment on. And so we're going to talk about significance, approach, innovation, the investigating team, and the environment. And if you want to learn more about what I'm going to be saying in this section, I highly recommend you take a look at these sources that I have on these slides because they are they're really solid and I think they'll be very helpful to you. So for the significance question, NIH reviewers are asked specifically these questions. Essentially, does the study address an important problem? How will this study advance knowledge? And what will be the effect of these studies in terms of other work that will come after this? These are the key questions. These are, literally the questions that reviewers have to work with. And so, as we know, all grant applications have to address an important problem to be considered important or relevant. Quantitative grants tend to articulate a narrow problem and identify a series of hypotheses that will be answered, and reviewers are used to that. But when you're working with qualitative data, you have a different set of problems typically. Applications that use qualitative data are often best suited to address broader and more complex problems. And qualitative methods are often used when not much is known about a topic or an area or an issue or a phenomenon. In many cases, they're well suited to exploration. And therefore, a qualitative proposal might not include, in fact, typically doesn't include, proposed hypotheses to be tested. And many reviewers are still unfamiliar with that, so they will be surprised when they don't see hypotheses in your proposal. So you need to explain upfront why a hypothesis is not included in your proposal, why it's not appropriate for qualitative work, and you want to be upfront about the exploratory or the formative aspects of what you're doing. Now, a literature review brings another set of issues that can be dealt with through a qualitative lens in a different way. Obviously, literature reviews are supposed to demonstrate an awareness of the literature on a subject, including research in other disciplines as appropriate. And especially, it's going to be demonstrating the importance of the proposed research question by showing that there's a gap in our knowledge that the proposed study will address or begin to fill in. But there's a tension between constructing a persuasive and critical and concrete literature review and proposing an inductive study, which qualitative work often encompasses. And so you really have to balance these two things. There are a number of good suggestions for how to do this, and I have highlighted 3 here on this slide. You can use the existing literature to identify characteristics or attributes of a phenomenon that need to be better understood or defined by your work. You can use that literature to identify conceptual boundaries and propose that the current study will fill in missing knowledge inside those boundaries. And or you can use the existing literature to build a theoretical framework or an approach to addressing the proposed question or problem. So there's a lot of artful ways of doing this, but I just want to highlight here that you don't want to get yourself in a situation where you are basically, by putting together a terrific and thorough literature review, you are kind of boxing yourself in because there's no room for your more qualitative, inductive, exploratory study, right? You don't want to make it seem like everything on a subject is already known because you need to situate yourself up to identify a gap and then to fill it. Now let's move to the approach section. This, of course, is another way of saying your methodological approach or your methodological design. And in this section, reviewers at NIH and at other agencies are asked to rate you according to this, these 2 questions here, right? Essentially, are your methods adequately developed, well integrated, well reasoned, and appropriate to the aims of the project? Certainly also, you can see the second question is essentially a question about your limitations. Do you, as the applicant, acknowledge potential problem areas and think through how to address those? Now, the qualitative method that you're proposing to use has to, as I've said before, fit the research question or the problem. And research questions, that are designed to understand the beliefs or feelings or perceptions of a group of people generally require investigators to ask members of a group questions through techniques like interviews or focus groups. Research questions designed to understand the behaviors of a group of people generally require some type of observational method. And research questions designed to understand, let's say, the culture of a group might require a combination of observational and interviewing methods. And so you also want to, as a researcher, consider collecting things like material artifacts that might be produced and used by members of a culture. But the bottom line here is that the goals of the project are often going to shape are always, let's say, going to shape the type of interviewing and or the observational method chosen. But of course, there are also other important considerations because we don't live without context. So you'll have to also grapple with the limitations of budget and time and access, and that will also influence your methodological choices. But the bottom line here is that a rationale for your methodological choices has to be provided so that it's clear that the best method has been selected to provide the information that you're going to need to answer that research question. And you also need to, so you have to establish that the proposed methods and strategies are well justified. And so therefore you need to provide a detailed description of how the data will be collected and analyzed. For instance, with interviews, you might include details about the types of interviews that will be conducted, how your interview guides will be created and tested and refined, when interviews will be conducted, by whom they'll be conducted, how the interviews will be recorded and transcribed, and so on. With focus groups, you'll want to include details about how participants will be selected, who will lead or facilitate those focus groups. Will they be comprised of with heterogeneity or homogeneity in terms of the group composition, how the data will be analyzed, and so on. And with observations, you'll want to include details about how observations themselves will be done, whether they'll be, say, audio or video recorded, or with field worker notes, how the person will be positioned, what will be selected for observation, how the field notes will be prepared, and on and on and on. So different methods pose different types of considerations, and obviously those are just a few of the issues that are going to need description for studies using qualitative methods. But again, the bottom line is you need to provide a detailed account of the proposed methods for managing and collecting your data. Now, one issue that qualitative researchers often have to grapple with, get confronted with, is this issue of potential bias. So obviously, any grant proposal is going to need to describe the setting, the participants, and the situations that are going to be studied. And again, as I said just a minute ago, those choices need to be well explained. But often the goal in qualitative research is to maximize the opportunity to observe a particular phenomenon of interest, because your N, the number of units that you're looking at, is considerably smaller than it would be with quantitative work. Therefore, you might want to consider spelling out for reviewers the fact that in many qualitative studies, it's best to maximize this so-called bias because it allows researchers to gather the best example of your phenomenon of interest. And in doing so, you might think about asking and addressing the following questions specifically. Will the setting optimally allow for examination of the phenomenon of interest? The answer should be yes. Will the participants selected be the best examples? The answer should be yes. And will the events observed be the most representative of the phenomenon of interest? Again, hopefully the answer is yes. And so you want to be clear about whether the events and your sample that you've selected are going to be representative of the population. In many cases, the answer is going to be no with qualitative work because the N, again, is much smaller. But in some cases, it will be if the population of interest is a relatively small or contained segment of the population. But either way, you need to explain why and why not. Now, reviewers also need to, with any grant proposal, reviewers are going to be expecting proposals to provide the approximate sample size that's necessary to identify clear themes and or develop theory, and also, again, to answer your research question. In qualitative research, generally the best way to go is to propose theoretical or purposeful sampling. Again, you're not going to, in most cases, be able to be putting together a sample that is representative of the population at large. And you also want to focus on achieving thematic saturation, and then to build in the flexibility in your timeline to determine when saturation is reached. And the truth is, with sampling in qualitative work, you often can't predict how large your sample is going to need to be to reach saturation, but you can use sample sizes from previous studies that are similar to yours to approximate what kind of sample size will likely be needed. And then you can also do things like, discuss the scope of the study, use the literature to discuss the expected variation in the setting or the phenomenon, and then provide a rationale for what your expectations are for sampling. Again, leaving in some wiggle room in case you don't reach thematic saturation at the point that you expect to. Now, there's also another issue that qualitative researchers often have to face, or a set of accusations that you want to be upfront about in your grant proposal so that you can get ahead of it if the reviewers have it in mind. So there's fairly strong agreement among qualitative researchers that good qualitative research should be evaluated in terms of its completeness and adequacy and trustworthiness. And what that really means is that another researcher should be able to understand and appreciate the account that you've given and feel that it's trustworthy, not suspicious. And so there are several techniques for verifying qualitative accounts, and including one or more of these techniques would be likely very helpful for reviewers, partly, or at least not least, because it will show that you know what you're talking about. So this is certainly more in depth than we have time for in this particular webinar, but you might want to look into techniques listed on this slide. So triangulation, prolonged engagement, persistent observation, peer debriefings, and so on. I'm happy again to talk more about those in the Q&A or in subsequent communications. And then finally, your approach needs to include a thoughtful analysis plan. Reviewers, of course, are going to need to be able to evaluate whether your study will answer your research question again, produce the necessary results, and produce the degree of certainty or depth necessary for answering your question. And therefore, your strategy should describe a process that allows for sample generation and analysis to co-occur, often iteratively, as is very common for qualitative work, until saturation is reached. Your plan should allow adequate time for researchers to immerse themselves in analyzing the data and identifying and refining emergent themes. And especially, we'll talk more about this in just a minute, but identifying your plan should identify an ideally multidisciplinary team that's committed to taking the time for analysis and how specifically that teamwork will take place. You want to specify, will there be regular telephone conferencing? Will there be in-person meetings? What's the duration? What's the frequency of the collaborative engagement? All of these things are important for reviewers to consider. The next section, the big bucket that reviewers will be asked to think about and evaluate you on, is about innovation. Is the project original and innovative? And for many people, many proposals, this can be tricky. But the good news for qualitative work is that, in fact, qualitative methods are very well suited to being employed when little is known about a particular issue. And therefore, qualitative research projects often tend to lend themselves to innovation. But you don't want to take this for granted. You do still want to spell this out and emphasize this in this section. So you want to talk openly about whether the approach represents a first or a breakthrough. Perhaps it's the first time a qualitative approach has been used to engage this particular substantive topic. Are you using the approach in a novel or creative way? And again, does the study get to the heart of the question? Because maybe it's your question itself that's innovative. Reviewers will also be asked to appraise your investigator team. So are the investigators appropriately trained and well suited to carry out the work that you propose? So a strong proposal needs to demonstrate evidence of a capable, again, ideally multidisciplinary team, a team with adequate experience doing qualitative research and adequate time allotted to do it, and also the ability to look at the research question and the data from a variety of useful and different perspectives. And the idea here is that a good multidisciplinary team will foster innovative thinking. You'll also be well advised to demonstrate evidence of the skill of the team, meaning the ability and productivity of using the methods that you've proposed, the ability to use a variety of methods, and you also want to be sure that it's clear that your co-investigators should have complementary skills. You also want to make sure that there's adequate training for research staff, particularly those collecting data. So you want to be clear about how the research staff will be trained, who will be doing the training, and are they experienced? And particularly also, are there hands-on opportunities that are built into the training process so that staff can get feedback and try it again before going back into the field? It's also well advised to put together a team that's comprised of both insiders and outsiders. Here, and insiders or outsiders relevant to the substantive focus of interest. In healthcare research, insiders might be, for instance, clinicians who might have better access to a site and have more credibility within it. But the outsiders are just as important. So those might be people who are unaffiliated with clinical practice, like social scientists, and who aren't members of the culture or the subculture that's being studied, because the outsiders may be better positioned to see the hidden assumptions and identify implicit or tacit knowledge. Finally, I want to say a little bit about the environment, this last of the 5 buckets that you'll be evaluated on. This is essentially, is the place where the work is going to be carried out sufficiently supportive, and will it contribute to the probability of success? So obviously those kind of questions are appropriate for any research study, but for qualitative projects, you'd be well advised to make sure you explicitly mention these 5 bullet points here. Collaborative relationships with other qualitative researchers, scientific environment that has an understanding of the qualitative research project, tech support and research team familiarity with the qualitative software you're going to use, and personnel who are trained and experienced in collecting qualitative data, as well as past successful experiences, ideally completing qualitative studies within that institutional environment. I'm going to say just a couple words here about qualitative budget considerations. It is probably not going to come as a surprise to you to know that proposals should have enough time and money budgeted to accomplish what your goals are in terms of data collection and analysis. But I'm spelling it out anyway because you'd be surprised how many budgets are completely unrealistic. Qualitative research in particular can be expensive and time-consuming. Not only are the equipment and the transcription that are involved often quite costly, but the data collection and analysis in qualitative work takes time and often needs to involve a knowledgeable team. So you really do need to allot enough time and money for the adequate training of people who are going to be collecting and analyzing your data. And if your project timeline is too short and it doesn't allow the adequate time needed to really engage in the analytic process, not only will you be stuck at the end, but reviewers will fault you for that. People are very experienced at this point in understanding what a realistic timeline looks like, and you need to put one together, and you also need to have a budget that can support that. There are a number of budget items to consider for qualitative work. Personnel, certainly. Equipment, that might include digital recorders or other kind of data collection and storage devices, your software, a variety of different kind of supplies. Transcription is often very relevant in qualitative work and can be quite expensive. And a note here, the tape to labor ratio is key for rate calculation in transcription. I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. Certainly you might want to build in travel, both to collect your data as well as potentially to conferences. You want to think through participant incentives that won't be, in the language of IRB, coercive, but will nonetheless be incentivizing for people to participate. And think through a variety of other elements too. Perhaps food and drink for your participants, a fee for the facilities where the interviews or the focus groups might take place, money for consultants or trainees, and perhaps consortium or contractual costs like subcontracts to vendors or investigators at other institutions. The bottom line about this point, though, is that you want to think carefully about the effort of each team member. If they're named in the budget, make sure that they're named in the science. There needs to be a reason for everybody to be on the grant. And at the same time, you want to make sure that you have the expertise across your team to accomplish your research goals. Keep in mind that incentives could also be objects. In fact, I worked on a study where participants were homeless veterans several years ago, and instead of giving money, we gave them things like socks and t-shirts, and that was very well received. Occasionally, you can give people cash, but it's typically advised to give gift cards. And remember that the budget, as I said before, is not part of your review criteria, but reviewers will see it, and it will be a factor in their decisions. Also keep in mind that it is not atypical for budgets to be cut about 5 to 15%, even if the grant is awarded. So be sure you're thinking through, you don't want to pad your budget in an obvious way, but make sure you have thoughts ahead of time about how you might effectively manage such a cut if it comes to you, because again, it is not atypical for that to happen. We are, of course, running out of time, and I want to very quickly highlight the things that I think are most important about this third section, using mixed methods, essentially making the case for mixed methods research. Mixed method studies are increasingly common and expected now, and the reason for that is that they are now regarded as sort of the gold standard because they combine the strengths of quantitative data, namely breadth, with the strengths of qualitative data, which is typically depth. So you don't want, ideally, you don't want to have a qualitative data set alone because it's best contextualized within the breadth provided by quantitative work. But quantitative work often isn't great to stand alone without an understanding of the details and the process that really inform it and help us to understand why. So we want to combine the strengths if at all possible. We are all probably familiar with the basic difference between quantitative and qualitative methods. Quantitative methods are excellent at deduction, are generally viewed to have more objectivity, although I should put that in quotations, and are better at generalization, again, because there's more significant breadth. Qualitative methods, though, on the other hand, are great at understanding aspects of a topic that are intensive, nonlinear, and might require interaction for the fullest understanding. So it's particularly useful for eliciting perspectives and values and opinions of people in their own words, for understanding why practices may or may not be successful, and often identifying strategies for facilitating implementation or other kind of work. It allows us to get at the nuances and also the meaning behind the patterns that we're interested in. So effectively, you can combine qualitative and quantitative data to lots of beneficial effect. People typically will use quantitative data to look at outcomes, and then qualitative data to study processes, quantitative data to measure content, and then qualitative to understand context, or qualitative data to explore a phenomenon and then generate a model or set of potential hypotheses, and then quantitative data to test those hypotheses to confirm the model's validity. But the list, and these are just several common ones, but the idea is that, that the two together are the strongest. But you don't just slap these things together. And so the key to strong mixed methods research lies in the effective integration of these. And effective integration is more than just collecting and reporting two or more sets of separate results. You need to be able to mix the data at some stage. And in terms of grantsmanship, you want to be clear about the implications of your choices regarding the nature and the timing of the integration. There are three basic ways of doing this. You can merge the data in the analytic phase when you bring your two types of data together to answer either the same question or related questions. You can connect the data, and that occurs when you analyze one set of data and that leads to the need for or subsequent collection of another set of data. Or you can embed the data, and that typically occurs when qualitative studies are embedded within larger quantitative studies in order to get that depth or expansion. But the idea here is that good mixed methods research needs to be, you need to think through how the data are or could be related throughout both the study design and the analysis phases. And to do that, you want to be clear and spell out for reviewers your thoughts about order and your rationale essentially for order and sequencing, priority, and purpose, both for each of the methods used and for the particular combination chosen. So you can use methods either simultaneously or sequentially, there's more to say about that, but I'll show you what I mean in the typology that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. You also want to be clear about which kind of method is typically going to be operationalized as primary or dominant. This is, in most studies, this is still typically quantitative methods because breadth is often valued more than depth for many scientific inquiries. And also assessing processes is typically viewed as secondary to evaluating effectiveness. But it doesn't have to be this way. And in fact, when you're doing things like looking at barriers and facilitators, the two types are often given equal weight. Again, though, you just want to be clear about your rationale to demonstrate mastery over your subject and to show that you know what you're talking about in terms of your the specifics of your method and your purpose. So you also want to be clear about the purpose of the methods that you're using and the combination, whether they're going to be used to answer the same question or related questions. Now, I mentioned typologies just a minute ago, and I want to highlight briefly here 4 relevant mixed method design typologies. The first is the convergent parallel design. This involves the simultaneous collection of quantitative and qualitative data, and then merging the two types together. The explanatory sequential design involves 2 sequential phases. Quantitative data are collected first here, followed by the collection of qualitative data to help explain patterns in the quantitative data. Then we have the opposite order, the exploratory sequential design, where qualitative data are collected first, followed by the collection of quantitative data in order to provide breadth for the patterns that emerged from the qualitative data. And then finally, the multi-phase design, which is essentially a catch-all, if you will, involving a typically iterative series of phases or separate studies, each of which might use a combination of sequential and or concurrent phases. You can see here in this example that there's both a qualitative study at first, and then another qualitative study, and then a mixed method study. But you really could have any sequence here that is, again, adequately proposed, can adequately address your subject and your research question. Now, there are a number of barriers to using mixed methods still, and I want you to think about this as an opportunity for social scientists who are looking to get into external funding. Particularly in the health world, but also in other scientific fields as well, there's a relative dearth of training in and even exposure to qualitative methods. And even so, people typically have training, certainly mostly in quantitative work, but it tends to be either or. And in these fields, there's often a relatively few opportunities for collaboration with social scientists or other people who may be more familiar with qualitative methods. And again, I want you to think about this as an opportunity for you to contribute to a larger team and to become more familiar and experienced with external grantsmanship. The bottom line, though, is that when we're thinking about grantsmanship, particularly with qualitative data, I want you to remember, but really with any kind of data, I want you to remember that fit is almost everything, right? And I mean here that, ultimately the most important thing after selecting the right funding mechanism for your work is to choose the design that's most appropriate to answer your research question, whether that's a mixed methods design or solely qualitative or solely quantitative work. Don't just use a mixed methods approach because you think it's the best. You have to have a reason for doing that. And always having a coherent and defensible rationale for why you're doing what you're doing is critical. Reviewers will be looking for that above all. And once you've done that, you just have to use the right language to translate it effectively to those who'll be reviewing your grant application. And hopefully this webinar has given you some language and some insight into how to do just that. I realize that we've gone through a lot of material here. And so I welcome you to think through this material and then to contact me if you'd like to learn more or to have any more substantial discussions about any of this. Thank you so much for being here today. I've enjoyed delivering this, and I look forward to talking with you either online now or offline. And with the recognition that we are now at the top of the hour, I want to pause. I'd love to stay and have some Q&A for those of you who can do so. But if you can't, please feel free, as I said, to contact me at either of these email addresses. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Albright. I really want to thank Dr. Albright for taking the time out of what is as you can imagine with all that grant money, a really busy day. She has a lot of projects going on, and it's a testament to the thoroughness of her approach, which she was kind enough to lay out for us in the webinar. And I also want to thank everybody who signed up for the webinar, attended it, and also are going to stream the webinar at some future date. And just to remind everyone, you can download the webinar at our Applied U YouTube channel provided by the AACS. I also want to encourage people to go to the AACS website at aacsnet.net for information regarding our upcoming annual meeting, which this year will be in Portland, Oregon in October. And our next webinar, just to refresh, in case you missed it, joined us late, will be on February 25th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Dr. Jonathan White, when he will be talking about social entrepreneurship. With that, if there's any questions, please type them in the chat box. And otherwise, if you're up against the clock with another appointment, you can contact Dr. Albright directly at the email she provided. All right, well, I don't see any questions right now. So what I'm going to do is I'll go close out the webinar and thank Dr. Albright again for providing that information. And thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thanks very much.